One of the greatest mysteries is found at the heart of a founding ritual of Christianity, the Grail. For centuries, this term has referred to the cup used by Jesus during his Last Supper. But no one can say what it looks like.
Nobody knows, but could be any of these. He used them in the Last Supper.
However, dozens of churches are confident that they are in possession of this highly symbolic cup.
We see what Jesus saw. The Lord held the sacred cup in his hands.
Is one of these authentic? And how do we know whether the Grail truly exists? To clarify this enigma, we have tracked the Grail from Jerusalem to Spain and to the south of France. But the closer we get to it, the more it seems to escape us.
Drink of it, all of you. This is my blood.
The quest for the Grail begins in Jerusalem, the holiest of holy cities. Specifically, it starts on Mount Zion, a hill located in the southwest of the city. It was to there that Jesus traveled in the last days of his life. Brother Venard will explain in what context the famous cup arose, the one later called the Grail.
At the time when Jesus arrived in Jerusalem, he was at the peak of his glory. He was acclaimed as the messianic king expected in the dynasty of David. Hosanna to the Son of David. Yet, at the same time, he knew that his life was threatened.
Too popular in the eyes of the Romans who controlled the city, too scandalous in the eyes of the Jewish priests, Jesus had many enemies. He sensed that his end was nigh.
So they were outside of the central area of the city, somewhere a bit off the beaten path. It's clear that Jesus felt safer there.
The tension was extreme when he gathered his disciples for his very last meal.
So Jesus sent 2 of his disciples, telling them, "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him, and he will show you a large upper room, furnished and ready."
The Bible describes Jesus' last meal in detail, known as the Last Supper. It was during this dinner that a cup appeared for the first time that would leave an indelible mark on humanity. But why is it so important? To find out more about this enigmatic object, we travel to the site of the traditional pilgrimage of Jesus' Last Supper, a magnificent Franciscan building known as the Cenacle. It is in this room that a ritual is commemorated that has firmly established the cup in all minds, the Eucharist.
That evening, he took the bread and shared it, saying, "This is my body." And then he took a cup of wine and passed it around, sharing that too, again saying, "This is my blood." In the Jewish tradition, drinking blood is something that is deeply taboo, but the actions and words were sufficiently scandalous for this to be deeply etched into the hearts of his disciples.
But it's worth noting that the supper took place during Passover, a very important festival. It commemorates the flight of the Hebrews from Egypt, an event told in the Bible. It was the sacrifice of a lamb that protected the Hebrews from death.
And Jesus said, "Well, actually, I am that lamb, the sacrificial lamb that sheds its blood, so that you escape death and are saved. Well, it's my own blood. And I'm giving you this blood as a beverage to drink from this cup."
The day after this meal, Jesus was crucified. His sacrifice sealed his alliance with humanity. and the cup is the symbol of that alliance. What did this cup look like? The Bible doesn't say a word to describe it. The Holy Book only explains that this object was found at the home of a mystery owner. But who was that person? Did that individual provide the cup? The Cenacle can't tell us more because the edifice dates from the Middle Ages, centuries after Jesus' time. But archaeology provides some interesting clues. Excavations undertaken on Mount Zion have unearthed remains from the 1st century.
They found the substructures of rather luxurious buildings, mansions with mosaics, etc.
So Mount Zion was an opulent neighborhood. Jesus and his disciples may have been invited there because a rich resident might have lent them their home and their crockery.
This person reserved, in some sense, a room that was sufficiently vast and also plausibly owned a cup that was different from your average vessel. It might have been made of onyx, or at any rate, a semi-precious stone that was available to the host of Jesus and his disciples.
For Brother Venard, there's no doubt that the cup from the Last Supper would have been of great value. A precious object is what we're looking for. But some discoveries might call into question our idea of the cup. What if it was in fact more modest, reflecting Jesus himself, a humble preacher? In the 1940s, on the banks of the Dead Sea, in Qumran, excavation revealed thousands of earthenware pieces dating from the 1st century. In other words, from the time of Jesus. Fragments that have hardly ever been shown to the public. They are kept at the prestigious Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem. Thanks to archaeologist Jean-Baptiste Ambert, who participated in the excavation, we obtained exceptional access to the storerooms. It's there that the treasure of Qumran is hiding.
Okay, this is Qumran.
I shall try to see this number.
05.
05, okay. Oh.
What if a cup similar to the one from the Last Supper was hidden on these shelves?
Complete one. Excellent, yeah, good.
Okay, you have one. You have another cup. You have this
Oui.
one. Okay.
Oui,
The remains from Qumran allow us to see some of the crockery used at the time of Jesus up close. Jean-Baptiste Ambert will show us what they look like.
So these were very common ceramics in the 1st century, and that fit the evocation we wish to make very, very well. Common meals, even at Easter, had no tables or plates, forks or knives. Everyone plunged their hands and took out their desired morsel.
For the archaeologist, we must therefore imagine the guests seated on the floor around a large dish with an earthenware jar used to transfer the wine to a pitcher, and finally a single cup that was passed from hand to hand.
Instead of a beautiful and luxurious cup, actually, they'd have the most common cup of the most working-class people of Jerusalem. That is, a pottery cup, made of terracotta. It's pretty, but it's really a humble piece of pottery. And in my opinion, it's exactly the one that needs to be restored to the context of the Last Supper.
For Jean-Baptiste Ambert, there was no banquet table, as you might expect. There would be no chalice made of precious stones or onyx either.
Jesus of Galilee was a humble and poor man, from the working classes. So this fits the bill.
So this is how we can imagine Jesus' Last Supper. And the cup would be a basic tumbler. We went to the University of Tel Aviv to better understand the religious customs of the day because Jesus was a practicing Jew. So what does a ritual Jewish cup look like? An expert in ancient ceramics explains the importance of the Mishnah, a code of conduct established by the rabbi of that period.
The Mishnah clearly states that this type of ware, stone vessel, will always remain pure. The impurities won't seep through it, as opposed to this. If anything impure, even if it's non-kosher wine, touches a ceramic vessel, there's no way to clean it back for it to be pure. So if you're looking for some vessel that was used for a ritual, there is a possibility that something like this was used.
The archaeologist instead tends towards a stone vessel. She suggests a limestone cup, the most commonly used stone in Jesus' day. But did Jesus, the reformer of Judaism, truly respect Jewish dictates?
In his addresses to his apostles, his disciples, he explains that what matters is the heart, and not the object or the purity of the object. So the goblet of the Last Supper might have been kosher, but no one can prove it. And anyway, it wasn't important to Jesus.
Was the receptacle of the Last Supper made of clay pottery or stone? A modest tumbler or a luxury chalice? All of these hypotheses are possible. And one last crucial question can be asked. What happened to the cup after the meal? Was it put back in the cupboard, in which case that's the end of the story? Or did one of the disciples or the owner of the cup understand its importance and conserve it?
What we do know is that the disciples were quite quickly dispersed. Jews as a whole were persecuted, and Christians in particular, so we know that they fled Jerusalem and Judea. The real question is whether or not they might have had with them some of the objects that Jesus knew, and that question remains unanswered.
As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so must you also testify in Rome.
If the cup was transported outside of Jerusalem, then where was it taken? An initial trail leads to Rome, where, according to Christian tradition, Peter, an apostle of Jesus who was present at the Last Supper, allegedly took it with him. After the terrible persecution of Christians in the year 258, one of the Pope's loyal deacons managed to send the chalice to his home in northern Spain. The cup was passed from churches to chapels, arriving in Valencia in the 15th century. It's purportedly still found there today. To check out this lead on the Grail, we went to Valencia, on Spain's eastern coast. The small streets and squares of the old town send us back in time to St. Mary's Cathedral, a treasure of Gothic art. This is where a relic is presented as the Holy Grail. We meet with Alvaro Almanar Picalo, the guardian of the precious relic. He's preparing to open up the reliquary that holds the vessel for a rare viewing.
We wear gloves out of respect and reverence.
He's assisted for the occasion by a member of the Brotherhood of the Grail, who carefully opens up the display case.
Careful.
Alvaro handles the reliquary with extreme care. He is convinced that it is the real cup from Jesus' Last Supper.
We see what Jesus saw. The Lord held in his hands this sacred vessel. Dear brothers, we are preparing to show the relic of the Holy Chalice, asking the Lord to accord us the grace of doing so with reverence and respect.
This prayer thanks the saints and all those who enabled the chalice to reach Valencia.
In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
The guardian of the chalice can now open the reliquary. Alvaro will allow us to observe the holy relic in detail, in a rare close-up viewing.
Only the upper part is authentic. It's a benediction chalice, used during the ritual of the Jewish Easter. But in the 11th century, to highlight the fact that it was a sacred vessel, these gilt handles were added, with all the expert skill and fine craft that you see here.
What if the cup that we are seeking was the upper section of this relic? This ceremony is held on the occasion of a great festival that celebrates the Chalice of Valencia every last Thursday of October. A solemn procession exhibits the relic before the hundreds of believers in attendance at the cathedral. The Holy Chalice of Valencia is undoubtedly the object of great devotion. It has even earned the auspices of the Vatican. Popes John Paul II and Benedict XVI have used it to celebrate Mass. But what proves that it is in fact the cup from Jesus' Last Supper? To find out, we meet Anna Maffei, a doctor in art history in the magnificent library of the Museum of the Patriarch in the heart of Valencia. The Chalice of Valencia has been retraced as far as Rome. Where did the relic come from? The researcher wants to show us that the cup of Jesus was in fact found in Rome in the first centuries of our era.
I'm sorry, but I'm so moved.
Anna Maffei is taking out an ancient book for us, a version of the Roman canon that records the ways in which the very first popes said Mass in Rome.
Bueno, cálice. Cuando el sacerdote recoge la copa,
when the priest picked up the cup, raised it and looked at it, he said, according to the Roman canon, Unc praeclarum calicem, meaning this glorious chalice.
It's the demonstrative pronoun this that is important. It means that the priest was holding in his hands the same cup as Jesus.
What the Roman canon directly suggests is that this chalice, used at that time, is the chalice from Jesus' Last Supper. So it is assumed that in Rome, there was a special chalice that commemorated the memory of Jesus.
So Anna Maffei is convinced that the chalice of Jesus was once found in Rome. For her, it's the same chalice that then traveled to Spain. Anna Maffei has other arguments to show us that the Chalice of Valencia is indeed that of the Last Supper. The researcher, who devoted years of study to the relic, leads us to an optical laboratory in the city. She's in possession of the best replica available. For her, the upper part of the cup is indeed a Hebraic cup, made not long before Jesus' time.
The Holy Chalice is a cup made of stone that has been cut and polished by hand. This can be seen by the naked eye. This method clearly indicates that the cup was made in the 1st or 2nd century BCE.
What kind of stone is it? Very similar stones were often confused in the past.
Today, with the gemological classification of stones, the only thing that differentiates the sardius I'm holding here from agate is refraction.
This technique allows the angle of deviation of the light within a material to be measured. Anna Maffei was the first to have applied it to the chalice. This is how she was able to identify with certainty from which stone it was carved.
We now know that the stone of the Holy Chalice is an agate.
Besides respecting the principles of Jewish purity, this semi-precious stone was found in the Middle East in Jesus' day. So it's probable that it was used to make the cup from the Last Supper. The researcher has one last argument for proving the authenticity of her chalice. She reveals one of the very first representations of the Holy Grail. This painting is derived from the catacombs of Rome and dates from the 3rd or 4th century CE.
We approached the Roman catacombs and we saw that a chalice was found there that has the same stain in the same place. The ochre and orange tones like the chalice of Valencia. This corresponds to the agate illuminated by candlelight.
According to Anna Maffei, the chalice of Valencia is the one that the first Christians were using in Rome. For her, it is the authentic holy cup. The problem is, like the researcher, dozens of churches all over the world claim to hold the holy chalice. We find another holy chalice in Leon, Spain, the chalice of Ardagh in Ireland, and another grail allegedly went to Glastonbury Abbey in England. How do we know which is the right one? And why do they all seem to have cropped up at the same time in the Middle Ages?
In the Middle Ages, we observed the proliferation of grails. Many candidates were saying, "It's us, we have the Holy Grail." No, we have it. The relics became so important that it actually became a traffic. The churches that claimed to have this or that relic could, in that way, galvanize crowds, fill their pews. So everyone did it. There was a kind of competition. It became a real business.
In the Middle Ages, the cult of relics was in full swing. This was the era in which St. Louis, King of France in the 13th century, spent over half the annual earnings from the royal domain to acquire the crown of thorns, the one that Christ wore before his crucifixion. He had the Sainte-Chapelle on the Ile de la Cité in Paris built especially to accommodate it. At the time, relics were so revered that it was imagined that there would be one superior to all the rest. An ultimate relic endowed with full powers, that would be the Grail.
Then Joseph of Arimathea took a cup in which he put the blood of Jesus Christ.
Originally, the cup from the Last Supper was not called Grail. To understand where this name came from, we must delve into the literature of the Middle Ages, because it was in a novel that the Grail appears for the first time. This tale unfolds in the enchanting atmosphere of Brittany, among age-old oak trees and dolmens. This novel, signed by French author Chrétien de Troyes in the late 12th century, was to mark all of Europe. The book was called Percival, the Story of the Grail. At Quimper Castle in the forest of Brocéliande, ardent fans come to celebrate the legend of the Grail. Among them is Claudine Glos, the chair of the Arthurian Legend Centre. It was in a castle like this one that Percival, a knight of the Round Table, saw a strange cortege pass by.
They escorted a lovely lady, elegantly dressed, who held a grail in her hand. Such great light emanated from it that the candles dimmed, like the stars at sunrise or a waxing moon.
In the novel, we understand that the Grail is a kind of supreme relic, but nothing indicates that it's the cup from the Last Supper. So where did this surprising object come from? For Claudine Glos, it derives from Celtic lore. spread by troubadours in the Middle Ages. Incredible stories from Brittany and Great Britain.
The stories that come from there are total fantasy. There are fairies, there's a passageway from another world, there are heroes with unprecedented powers, and there are also talismans found nowhere else. That is, swords, lances, and among other things, there are cups. The Grail relates to these cups, among other things, resurrection cups, cups of bounty and eternal life found in Irish tales.
Chrétien de Troyes' Grail is apparently some kind of Celtic talisman. So how did it become assimilated with the Bible cup? In fact, Chrétien de Troyes never finished his novel. Other authors were to continue the tale, giving the Grail an increasingly Christian meaning.
I think all the same that an object that extraordinary, capable of regenerating everything, restoring life, food, abundance, peace, and harmonious relationships between people, an object of that kind could only emanate from what is the most powerful, beautiful, and best. That is, religion, and above all, Christ himself.
Some 15 kilometers from Quimper Castle, Claudine Glo leads us into a village that harbors a surprising church, the Church of the Grail. Here, the story of the life of Christ rubs shoulders with fairies and mythical creatures. In front of the altar, Claudine Glo will show us how the Grail emerged from the encounter between Celtic legends and some wonderful Gospels that were banned by Catholic institutions, known as Apocrypha. The central stained glass window represents a character who was to change the face of the Grail.
Joseph of Arimathea, the man who was to play a major role in the history of the Grail, is a character who appears relatively little in the biblical texts, and he mostly appears in what are known as the Apocryphal Gospels.
Joseph of Arimathea in the Gospel is presented to us as a disciple of Jesus, but a secret disciple. He is a notable, and so he's rich. He has a tomb that has not been used, that he has prepared for himself, but he decided to place Jesus' body in it. So after the crucifixion, he collected the body of Christ and brought it into this tomb.
The Apocryphal Gospels have many other revelations about Joseph of Arimathea in store for us. They tell us that it was him, in fact, that provided the cup for the Last Supper. Apparently, he was the anonymous patron of Jerusalem. And it was also this man who collected a few droplets of Jesus' blood after his death and placed them into that same cup.
The cup became doubly sacred, once for the Eucharist, and then it received the holy blood. This cup was transfigured. It's no longer the same cup. It's no longer an ordinary object. It's become a holy object, a sacred object.
Charged with pagan legends and powers from Christ, part relic and part legend, the Grail became an extraordinary object capable of anything. It revives the dead, endows eternal life, and provides food in abundance. In Chrétien de Troyes' novel, the Grail is the subject of a legendary quest reserved for King Arthur's Knights of the Round Table.
One land, one king!
The one who will find the Grail will solve its mystery and fly up to heaven. The Grail thus ennobles the idea of chivalry. Armed with divine power, it became an ideological instrument in the wars of religion. Because between the 11th and 13th centuries, the Crusades were raging in the Holy Land, the region of the Near East where Jesus had lived and died. At the Pope's behest and that of Western kings, Christians fought Muslims, whom they called infidels, for the control of this land where the tomb of Christ was found. But Jerusalem was definitively lost for Christians in 1187.
In this context of failure, of defeats, the ability to federate once again around a central element that represented the divine presence was a kind of flag of the Christian faith. It was something very important. The Grail was to become a symbol of the divine presence that ensured victory over the enemy and the forces of darkness.
This fascination for the Grail was to last for centuries and grew with each new battle. These combats were to fuel some of the myths surrounding the Grail. The front line eventually left the Holy Land, migrating to the south of France. The religious authorities wanted to pursue those who opposed the Roman Catholic doctrine. Among the heretics was a powerful movement that caused the Pope and the King of France to tremble: the Cathars.
The kingdom is within you.
Overlooking the valleys of Ariège in southwest France, Montségur Mountain is swathed in the mists of legends. In the 13th century, it was there that the Cathari Church, persecuted throughout the south of France, established its capital. In the distance, scrutinizing the fortified village, thousands of men sent by the King of France and the Church prepared to launch their assault.
So for the Crusaders, Montségur was above all the synagogue of Satan, the symbol they'd been sent to defeat. The idea of all these lords was to reduce the Cathari to ashes in a bloodbath.
To protect themselves, the Cathari transformed the whole mountain into a stronghold. In 1244, the assailants took 11 months to destroy this citadel. But why did they send 10,000 men to face several hundred Cathars and their allies? Why such perseverance?
The Roman Church saw a second rival Christian church starting to emerge, and it could not tolerate that. But there is another, more underlying reason. The Cathari had something to hide. And obviously, if it's Christians you're talking about, that can only be the Grail.
According to the legend, it's because the Crusades wanted to recover the Grail at all costs that the fighting was so determined. Documents from the time effectively show that the Cathari placed a number of treasures out of harm's way. Could one of them have contained the Grail?
There is a real treasure at Montségur, which is a monetary one. However, this treasure corresponds to the money paid by the faithful to allow the Cathari Church to survive, to pay soldiers, to buy food. All that cost money.
Did the Grail ever pass through Montségur? One event sows the seeds of doubt. While over 200 Cathars were preparing to die on the pyre rather than recant, 4 of them fled in secret.
The only thing we do know is that 4 fugitives, who were the only Cathars to escape from Montségur alive, left Montségur by descending a cliff face, according to the texts. And they brought with them a bag, which was slung over the shoulder of one of them. The trouble is, we don't know what was in the bag.
Had these 4 Cathars been elected to safeguard the Grail from their enemies? But where did the 4 Cathari go? We tried to follow their tracks. They lead us into a remote valley of the Ariège, about 30 kilometers from Montségur. It's there that a steep path allows us to access an abyss within the rock.
Hello everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you beneath the overhang of Lombrives Cave, which, as you all know, has a lot of surprises and wonders in store. I invite you to follow me.
Today, guide Michel Bierbont is hosting members from the spiritual school of the Golden Rosy Cross. Like the Cathari, they affirm that they were among the first Christians. Coming from Holland, Spain, and elsewhere, they're persuaded that they feel the presence of the Grail in this cave.
When Montségur fell, many of them flew here and they took with them their most precious idea, but also their most precious vase, and that was the Grail. And they hide themselves and their very important belongings here.
So did this maze of galleries once harbor the Grail? Is it still there?
These 4 Cathars headed towards Ariège, where we are now. It's not insignificant that we find ourselves here in Lombrive while evoking this famous treasure. Grail, that's right, cited by some. We are certain that these Cathari came through this valley.
But if the Cathars came this way, they must have left some trace. We explore this lair of giants for a long time, until we reach the entrance to a natural cavity.
I'll invite you now to carefully enter the Lombrive Cathedral. It's a relatively narrow passage, but which can be explained by the fact that, once again, to enter this sacred cathedral, it is necessary to have a bit of humility.
Owing to its silence and scale, the cathedral evokes a sacred temple, a site of religious initiation. Legend has it that it was here that the Cathars found refuge. Not only the 4 fugitives, but also hundreds of Cathari from the region, persecuted by the Inquisition.
It's a place that we are almost certain, due to thousands of symbols on these walls, had been frequented at various times. It is indisputably a place that served as a refuge during more or less turbulent periods.
The thousands of inscriptions etched into the walls are fascinating. Among them, were some made by Cathari?
I take this one. You see a cross, and that cross, that means resh. I'm sure that it goes back to the early Christians, and the Cathars had a link with the early Christians.
There are no Cathari inscriptions on these walls. There is nothing left to see. We know that it's been said on several occasions, the Inquisition eradicated anything that had been a memorial site for Cathari.
So were the Cathari remains erased? Or did they never go there? Neither them nor the Grail. The mystery remains. The Lombrive cave nevertheless remains a place of contemplation where Cathari spirituality is celebrated.
Holy Father, legitimate God of good spirits, who have never wronged, nor lied, nor strayed, nor hesitated, out of fear to meet death in the world of the foreign God. As we are not of this world, and the world is not ours, let us know what it is you know, and love what you love.
Why is the Cathari Grail so fascinating? There are, however, many who continue to believe in it. The most famous Grail hunter was a German archaeologist, Otto Rahn. He came to excavate caves in the region in the 1930s. The most surprising thing is that it was the Nazi regime that funded all of his research.
This research became known one day to Himmler, who was Hitler's right-hand man. And Himmler, who was passionate about esotericism, had taken a good hard look at these particular studies and had called on and met with Otto Rahn, who explained and debated with him about the power of this Grail.
But why did the Nazis embark on this quest?
We know that during World War II, the Nazis were also interested in the Grail, and we might well wonder why. Actually, the answer is quite simple. It's the same as at the time of the Crusades. They sought to claim a victory over the enemy. What's more, the Nazis had Gott mit uns written on their belts, meaning God with us. How better to illustrate the presence of God with us and the divine victory than through the finest of relics, the Holy Grail?
In the end, Otto Rahn never found the Grail. But his story later inspired Steven Spielberg in his cult film Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. The Nazi obsession for the Grail is part of the plot. The fascination for the relic is therefore no longer purely religious, but also personal and political. And this fever would even take hold of a small village in the south of France.
The Saviour loved her more than all the disciples, and he kissed her often on her mouth.
The search for the Grail leads us to Rennes-le-Chateau, a small village in the Aude, perched high in the south of France. Here, we're welcomed by a surprising sign at the entrance to the village. Excavation is prohibited on the territory of the town of Rennes-le-Chateau.
It's true that excavations are prohibited within the known territory of Rennes-le-Chateau, after some explosions started happening here and there in the village. So there were people who'd bought barns and were digging and digging. They started digging, and after that with dynamite tried to explode the rock, and often the roof tiles blew away.
The sign did not prevent some from digging a huge hole around the church in 2018. These explorers seemed they would stop at nothing to find a treasure, or even the Grail. But where does this mania come from? Writer Christian Dumergue will explain to us how a rural priest caused the life of the village to radically change upon his arrival in 1885. His name was Abbot Saunière.
He was full of passion, and his passion was to clash with the spectacle that awaited him here, because the church was almost in a state of ruin. In this church, it rained and blew a gale during Mass.
The abbot entirely renovated the church, but he also undertook extravagant constructions. He authorized the construction of the Villa Betanie, the neo-Gothic Magdalene Tower, and several gardens. But how did a simple priest find all this money? We know that he received donations and that he embezzled funds from his congregations. But this isn't enough to explain all of the expenditure. The accounts don't add up.
There is also another source of income that he kept secret. We have the correspondence he kept with one of his colleagues who tells him, "It's no one's place to bring your secret to light."
Did Abbot Saunière find a treasure or an important secret? This theory seems justified by the priest's strange behavior. According to complaints from residents, he and his servant allegedly entered the cemetery by night to dig at random. But what were they looking for?
In 1891, we know that he found a tomb during restoration work at the Rennes-le-Chateau church. It is clearly noted in this diary in which he wrote every day. The weird part is that after this discovery, the church renovations were stopped for some time. And when Abbot Saunière started the work again, he hired a new team of masons, as though he sought to hide something. It was in the years that followed this initial discovery that the priest started his research in the cemetery.
If Abbot Saunière found a tomb, he must have discovered the mysterious church crypt, in which the lords of the region were purportedly buried. A secret crypt that no one had ever found. And no archaeological dig had been conducted under the church's foundations. But georadar studies undertaken in the 2000s made an incredible revelation. Between 3 and 5 meters beneath the church's chancel, there was indeed a cavity. Abbot Saunière might very well have found something in the crypt. But what? Just some tombs? Or did he find an underground passage whose exit he was looking for in the cemetery? Or did he find a treasure? Layer upon layer is added to the mystery. What if the key was right under our noses?
There's a theory emerging that Abbot Saunière may have encoded his church, in fact, and that the church became a kind of treasure map. So if someone could read the clues left by Saunière, they could reveal his secret.
A treasure hunt that seems to lead to Mary Magdalene, Jesus' disciple. It was to her that Abbot Saunière dedicated his church.
There are certain elements that are strange about this church, notably the statues that Abbot Saunière chose. It doesn't seem to be an accident that if we take the initial letters of these statues, there is the Germain of Pibrac, Saint Roch, Anthony the Great, Anthony of Padua, and Luke. These first letters spell Grail, Grail in French. So we get the feeling that Saunière has left us a message there. What is interesting is that these statues, when they are connected, draw a big M inside the church for Mary, Mary Magdalene, and that at the heart of the M, there is a statue of Mary Magdalene.
Mary Magdalene could be the key to the Grail. Mary Magdalene, the privileged disciple of Jesus, who accompanied him through to his final days and witnessed his resurrection. Could she have received information from him? A secret that might call the fundaments of the church into question.
The Grail could be a hidden text, a lost text, a gospel that might be attributed to Jesus directly or to Mary Magdalene, who would have heard his teaching directly, a secret teaching that she'd been charged with retaining and that may have been excluded by the Church of Rome.
Writers and journalists who've come to explore the village went even further. Certain apocryphal gospels affirm that Mary Magdalene was Jesus' partner.
There is even a very recent tradition, if not modern, which goes even further and says that if there was a love story between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, perhaps they had a child together. That child would be the flesh and blood of Christ. It would have his DNA. So rather than imagining the Holy Grail as a receptacle, this cup, this object, it's possible that the Holy Grail could be this very child.
This highly controversial theory was used by Dan Brown in his bestseller, The Da Vinci Code. He thrilled readers by affirming that the Holy Grail was in fact royal blood. In other words, the descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. The book's success shows to what extent the Grail continues to fascinate us today. From one century to the next, it responds to a quest for salvation or a search for personal accomplishment. That's why the Grail has entered common parlance. It refers to any object that is highly prized, yet almost impossible to obtain.